Okay, well, I hear bells chiming that it's gone noon, and I see a little pop-up message saying that the webinar is now streaming live on Facebook. So I don't know about anyone else, but I will be multitasking for the next few seconds to get some Facebook posts going and circulating. Hopefully you'll do the same. Those who were not able to join us yesterday but are here today will obviously benefit from this session, but there may be people who aren't able to attend the conference at all, or because they weren't able to attend to much of it, haven't registered, but who might still benefit from seeing this on Facebook. So everyone who's here, why don't you just go on Facebook and let everybody know? There should be something. Joshua, will you tell them where to find it? Most convenient place to find it?
Yeah, the live stream is available on the Michigan Center for Early Christian Studies Facebook page. And so if you just look for that, you can certainly share that with others. The general conference information, of course, is available on the MCECS.org website. And so we'd also encourage people to follow along there as well. Videos of yesterday's keynote and the welcome will be posted onto the Facebook page and this website later today if you're not able to if you're not able to communicate with your friends today. So those are the two locations I would point out to people. If you're here and you were in attendance yesterday, I'm going to be moving some people in. We'd invite you to come onto screen just to be conversation partners in this informal welcome today, where we will be just talking casually about what we learned yesterday and some of the great presentations that we heard. So thank you, Jim, for being here. Is it Miriam? Forgive me, pronounce your name for me. Yes, great, good.
Miriam is fine.
Okay.
Good, well, welcome. I might ask Jim to say a few words just to recap the sorts of things he said yesterday on behalf of the sponsoring organization. But hopefully in today's session, we will have a mixture of yesterday's presenters, today's presenters, organizing committees and sponsoring organization members, people who participated in the conversation yesterday, people who didn't participate in the conversation yesterday and wish they had, people who didn't think they had anything to contribute to the conversation yesterday and since then have had all kinds of thoughts floating through their mind. I tried to contribute yesterday and did so and was coordinating things. And even so, I had lots of thoughts rushing through my head about the papers and the presentations and the Q&A. And so for those who are joining us, and particularly for those who may never have attended meetings of the Enoch seminar, this is what we do in these recap sessions most of the time. And I think it will work well this time as well. We don't spend a lot of time summarizing the papers, but we really try to reflect on them. We try to share the things that seem to us to be highlights of the previous day of the conference, things that have struck us at the intersection between papers, things that have occurred to us since then, and to keep the conversation going, but in a way that focuses on the previous day and gives a chance to engage with that as well as recap it before moving on to today. And that's often helpful, not just because it gives us a chance to extend the conversation from yesterday, but also because if you're like me, by the time we get through the second day, a lot of the things that were brought up in the first day, there's a risk they'll fade from view. There's a risk they will drift into the recesses of your mind. And all those things that you thought were interesting and you never jotted down just are lost. And so I hope that anyone who wants to be part of this opening session will indicate so. Just put your hand up and we'll invite you in. But let me invite Jim to say a few words on behalf of the Michigan Center for Early Christian Studies. And then I'll say a few things just to remind us of some of the themes from the first day, and then we'll see where things go from there.
Well, thank you, James. I'm glad to be able to say a word of welcome again. My name again is Jim Lepkowski, and I'm president of the board of directors of the Michigan Center for Early Christian Studies. And we're delighted to be able to sponsor this conference and work with James and all the others who put this together. We hope you understand that our mission is to promote the study of early Christianity, and this is a way to connect it to culture, which is what's critically important for our organization. And a part of culture that is so vibrant today that it's really a pleasure for us to be able to do this. We work closely as well with the Enoch seminar that Professor Boccaccini spoke about yesterday in this promotion effort. And so welcome, all of you. Welcome to this conference, and thank you for giving us this opportunity to make this contribution to our culture and bringing these two areas together, Christianity and science fiction, bring them together in this conference through the work of the organizers. And again, our website's been mentioned, MCECS.org, as well as our Facebook page. Please feel free to visit us and learn more about what we're doing. So I thank you for the chance to say a few words, and I look forward to what we're going to be talking about the rest of today.
Thank you so much. So for those who weren't here and for those who were here, some of the many themes that came up last time, and we ranged across a number of topics, including determinism. There was discussion of what quantum mechanics means. And of course, anyone who's looked into that subject, even just a little bit, will say, we're not really sure, right? What physicists are sure about is that the math works. And apart from that, the implications are hotly debated. And that's one of the things that makes science fiction a really important place to think about religion, think about worldview, think about values, because really it's the philosophical implications, the real world, not application so much, right? Not like your GPS working and giving you the correct location, but the significance in terms of, do we have free will and things like that, which are longstanding questions, but which, as long as there's been engagement of philosophy and of religion with physics, with the study of the natural world, the question of causality, the question of whether things are determined and to what extent, has always featured prominently. And one of the major shifts that has led to the worldview that we, probably all of us here to a greater or lesser extent, inhabit, is the shift from Newtonian physics to the rise of quantum mechanics, which at least raised the possibility of indeterminacy and certainly introduced an element of uncertainty, so that the idea explored in DEVS, and of course in Julie Gittinger's paper on DEVS, that if we know all the details down to the subatomic level of what's going on at any given moment, we can extrapolate both backwards and forwards, we can know the past and the future, and we can work all these things out. And one of the great things about that show is that it brings that possibility as something that can still exist within quantum mechanics to the fore, and yet acknowledges that it's one of several competing philosophies related to quantum mechanics. And so there could be a whole conference on Christianity, science fiction, and free will, right? And we would easily fill a couple of days and explore those topics. But we also had papers that focused on technology, that focused on labeling, that focused on sort of post-apocalyptic realities, that focused on canon. And of course, one of the things I find really interesting, so much so that I invented a card game, as some of you know, is the exploration of what science fiction's prominent use of canon has to say to biblical studies' prominent discussion of canon. And I think there's a lot more connecting those two. My favorite example, though, was actually featured. I don't know whether you could see it because most of us, when we're presenting, sit about this level, right, with our faces squarely in the middle of the screen or the little rectangle. But Maria Dorfler, when presenting for the occasion, wore a shirt that said "Han shot first." And in my classes on the Bible, I actually talk about that very point, because one can agree, as all Star Wars fans do, I think without exception, right? That may be the biggest difference between Star Wars fandom and adherence to the Christian faith, is that there's at least one point that all Star Wars fans seem to agree on, and that's that the first movie ever made, the first Star Wars movie, is canon, right? So that much I think we agree on. And yet fans can agree on that and yet debate whether Han shot first, because there are different versions in existence, competing versions, as it were, of the same text. And that's really strikingly analogous to the question of what happened. Did Jesus have an experience where he was brought a woman accused of adultery and say, whoever's without sin cast the first stone? Because that story is in some manuscripts of the Gospel of John, but not in others. And so, did Jesus say that? Did Han shoot first? Actually, surprisingly similar questions. And that's one reason why, and I want to say this not least to reassure Jim and his board at the Michigan Center for Early Christian Studies, that the things we're talking about here really do intersect with the study of early Christianity, the study of biblical texts, the study of ancient religion. It's not just the similarities between Enoch's story and an abduction scenario that make connections between what we're talking about at this conference and what that center usually sponsors. And I don't think it's coincidental that of the people who engage with the intersection of religion and science fiction, a striking number, more than one might expect otherwise, a striking number of us are coming to this subject from a background in biblical studies, right? Theology, theological ethics, things like that. People readily see the points of intersection, but there are some natural connections, I think, with biblical studies, not just because of canon and textual variation, but also because we think a lot about worldview. We spend a lot of our time thinking about how ancient cosmology is relevant to how the authors and key figures in these ancient texts that we study understood the world and wrote about the world, wrote about their experiences, viewed matters of religion and theology. And one thing that, whether they acknowledge it or not, all religious believers and all theologians do in every generation is to wrestle with the meaning of texts that come from a different time and place, a different worldview, a different cosmology, and the world as we now understand it. And so precisely at the intersection of biblical studies and science fiction, ancient religion and science fiction, there are wonderful conversations. Because one of the things that science fiction does, sometimes in a very comical and tongue-in-cheek way, sometimes merely engaging with stereotypes, but one way or another, it regularly intersects with the question of the future of religion. And that's something that religious people are concerned about, and increasingly so as church attendance is on the decline, but that scholars of religion, right, even those who may not be approaching this through the lens of a personal faith commitment or something like that, are interested in, because the dynamics that we study, the dynamics that impact the present, have been there throughout. And science fiction lets us imagine where things might head in the future. So there was a lot to talk about, and I'd be happy to continue the conversation from yesterday. But let me invite those who have joined me on the screen to see what your thoughts are after a rich first day, what things you're still eager to talk about, what new things have popped into your mind. And let me also welcome Deborah Forger, who is involved in the organizing committee, but wasn't on screen yesterday to get applause and thanks. And so make sure that she's properly thanked in person, face to face, as much as Zoom allows us to do that. So what should we talk about? Anybody want to get this conversation started other than me?
Okay, hi everybody. I was born in 1985, so I was pretty deep into the cartoons of the X-Men of the 90s. So with all that time traveling, superpowers, shape shifting. But the good part of it is that when I started to read the Bible, Genesis 6, it was all very familiar to me because of all these superpowers and that these mutants had. In the Book of Giants of the Dead Sea Scrolls, there's a lot of that. So thinking for these ancient Jews that wrote the Book of Giants and the Book of Enoch and everything that edited those books, it's pretty much the same. For example, we have Gilgamesh, that is also from the epic of Gilgamesh, Sumerian, cuneiform tablets. He appears in the Book of Giants as a Nephilim, right? We have also Humbaba, his partner of the epic of Gilgamesh. And in the Book of Giants, these angels that had babies with human women, they created these giants and monsters. So there was one part giants, one of them were giants, and the other of them were monsters. These giants, they one of them, he was able to fly. So it is like if he had wings, and it's very similar to that Greek Icarus, a character from Greek mythology, that Enoch tells this giant that watch out, don't fly too close to the sun, and that's parallel to Icarus, that he used to fly too close to the sun. So we have this parallel between these titans from the Greek mythology and these Nephilims from the Jewish our Bible.
Yeah, I think there's definitely something to explore there. So
Yeah.
let's pursue that a little bit, because one of the, when people ask me, why does science fiction regularly engage with religion? There are lots of different ways that one could answer that. Certainly, people who are not religious themselves include religious characters often in their stories. And I remember being on a panel once with sci-fi author John Scalzi, right, who wrote a number of things. Red Shirts is one of my favorites, just because it not only is it so comical, but it's thought-provoking and engages with religion in interesting ways. But asked once why he writes religious characters into his stories when he's not himself religious. And he said, because he writes human characters, and humans are religious, right, in one way or another. And I think that's,
yes.
You're gonna
Gilgamesh is going to appear in the Eternals.
Yeah,
from Marvel.
We'll talk about that. Yeah. So there are a number of reasons why, right? But I think one of the reasons why we get a lot of these things is precisely because science fiction is continuing a tradition of storytelling that goes back to ancient times, right? So it's one of the genres, maybe the genre par excellence, through which we reflect on our place in the universe, right? Oftentimes, if we look at something like, the psalmist, right, in the Bible, looking up at the sky and saying, when I behold the stars, the works of your hand, I wonder what is a human being that you're mindful of that. And so we ask those same questions. And so these stories that are being crafted, that have been crafted and that we continue crafting, attempt to update some of the things that we have always seemed to want to explore in our storytelling, right? Questions about the nature of humanity, questions about whether we're alone in the universe. So regularly, there are sort of alien-human hybridization schemes and things like that. And it goes right back to the not just Genesis, right? I think Genesis is probably a latecomer to this tradition, and Genesis with its sons of God and the daughters of men is probably trying to offer a different slant, right? A reinterpretation, maybe a more negative judgment on that whole tradition that there are, well, if there are gods and there are humans, then why not demigods, right? What happens if a celestial being and a human come together? What kind of powers might they have, right? Could they fly? Could they accomplish any number of things? On the other hand, one of the things that I find really interesting about science fiction is that in order to do that, it regularly mythologizes scientific concepts, right? So for instance, with the X-Men or heroes and evolution, right? The idea that evolution, just give it enough time, we even get this in Star Trek, give evolution enough time and we will have superpowers, right? We will have telekinesis, right? And to anyone here who's in attendance, right? Just a quick survey to get a sense of the audience. Anyone here who believes in telekinesis, please raise my hand. Sorry, it's an old joke. Not your hand, my hand, right? So, because if you have telekinesis, you can do that. But anyway, apparently evolution hasn't got us there yet. Radioactivity, right, with the Hulk and Spider-Man and things like that. And so one of the reasons why people turn to science fiction again and again is to explore this possibility and to introduce the kinds of characters, the kinds of scenarios that we've always loved, but in a science fictional, updated for a modern cosmology. And so one of my favorite lines on Doctor Who is, there's this episode in which there are these sort of strange creatures and things like that. And the Doctor says that having visited all these planets, all these worlds, one of the things he's learned is that monsters are real. Right? And monsters, aliens, right? Magic, science. We like to imagine that those are watertight. Oftentimes fans of science fiction who aren't fans of fantasy will get really up in arms about the distinction between the two. And yet, I think we all know that the line is blurry. Certainly Star Wars and Doctor Who blur there. But in addition to that, even if you think about Star Trek, right? Scientists will tell you that we're not likely to have a transporter, right? That it's just not likely that that technology will ever be real. And so teleportation, right, is the stuff of magic. And it was needed because of the limited budget to film landing sequences. And so they introduced it. Dilithium crystals, right? We'll see. At any rate, there's clearly, one of the things that science fiction does is to update that tradition of storytelling, right? And one thing that I think is really interesting is that very often both the shows and the fans of the shows have understood that to indicate that, so gods aren't real, angels aren't real, they're just aliens, right? One of my favorite examples of this, I mean, there's obviously a lot on Stargate, but Star Trek, Who Mourns for Adonis, and Captain Kirk says, Apollo's no god, though he might have been mistaken for one once. But if you have a being from another world who can do all these things, right, who can shoot lightning bolts and can grow in size and can grab the Enterprise, and in what sense is this not a god, right? It might not be the sort of monotheistic idea of God with a capital G, but of course that's not what ancient Greek religion was talking about. And so there's a sense in which sometimes science fiction treats gods and angels and these things as more literally true than any classicist, right? And then many other scholars of ancient religion. And I just find that fascinating. And so obviously, not going to, science fiction is the appropriate genre for, continuing these sort of fictional stories about beings from other worlds and things like that, exploring them. And what people do with them in our time is interesting, but the very fact that we love telling these kinds of stories, I think, is really interesting. Yeah, and so since Gavin was presenting on things that intersect with this, and I see some things coming in the chat, let me invite him to share a few words on this.
Sorry. Oh, okay. I'm sorry. It's just every time you say something, I was like, oh, that applies to Neon Genesis Evangelion. And I mean, it probably applies to so many other series as well. But, you know, since angels are entity of concern in there, according to the series never tells you where the angels come from. Right? They're discovered in Antarctica or in Japan, you know, underground, and they're implied to come from space somehow, but they never explain that. And most fans accept this background material, as I said, which comes from a video game. So they depend on a video game as their primary interpreter of the series. And as I point out, the angels are you know, in terms of their actual substance or their physical beings, which can be killed. You know, they're gigantic monsters. I said earlier, they're more like the Nephilim than the Watchers, even though some of them are named after the Watchers. But that's, I'm sure I'll interrupt again if something else reminds me.
Thanks. I saw that Will also had his hand up.
I was just going to say, one of the things that is common between science fiction and religion is that they explore things that are unknowable, and I think that's a common thing that actually unites them, but it's also something that actually divides or separates them, because I guess science fiction makes a confession that often religion or spirituality is not prepared to make, because often the criticism that I get when I'm engaging with science fiction with the church is that the church will say, oh, you're undermining or cheapening or removing the credibility of faith discussion by actually pairing it with science fiction. And when I'm talking about religion in science fiction, the nerds or geeks in that space will often say, well, you're attempting to make something certain that actually we'd prefer to remain playful and ponderous. So there's this alliance and animosity that actually occurs at the same time with religion and science fiction. That's I find absolutely a fascinating tension to live in.
Yeah, thank you. And I see Deborah and Miriam.
Yeah, kind of piggybacking on that, you know, my own specialization is in early Judaism and early Christianity. But one thing that I appreciate about science fiction as a genre is it enables one to imagine and create imaginative worlds. And just the nature of the genre allows a different sort of discourse than what I write in myself. So it's a nice way to engage with similar questions without sort of the constraints of academic discourse.
Yeah, for me also this idea that science fiction is about imagination. That's something that really struck me yesterday when Maurice said that, yeah, it's about, you know, imagining what could be and, you know, the power of that, the power of utopia and whatever, especially for him as an Afrofuturist. And I really felt that this is so alike to science fiction, but also alike to biblical stories, which kind of have this power of imagination of what could be or what has been and explains what is now and so on. And I feel on the one hand, it helps us, you know, engaged in the questions that we have now with this. But the other thing is that it also kind of may help us to understand the biblical thoughts more. Because, I mean, after all, we're all kind of people, and even the people 2,000-3,000 years ago made really terrible jokes and, you know, made graffiti and whatnot. And so I think maybe you can kind of find ways to engage with, you know, how does canon happen? How does fan fiction happen? And how maybe Apocrypha linked to fan fiction, all that. I really loved these thoughts yesterday. And they've been kind of going in my mind even before that, but they're stronger now. And I think, yeah, like, and I don't think it's demeaning to see the Bible in that way, but rather it's kind of, yeah, it's a little bit more playful, but it's also kind of giving you glimpses of, yeah, how thoughts and how imagination actually comes to be. And as a New Testament scholar, I really love that. Yeah, that other perspective on, yeah, how biblical thoughts and ideas and texts may have developed, just more in this kind of imagination, and how could the world be and how can we explain it and dream it in that kind of sense.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I've certainly been embracing lately the role of imagination in what we do, particularly in relation to historical reconstruction. I started out, some of you will know I have a recent book out. I keep wanting to say it's my most recent book. It's my most recent biblical studies book, because there's actually one that appeared just after that about a particular episode of Doctor Who. But my book, What Jesus Learned from Women, when I started out thinking of having a sort of a short bit of historical fiction at the start of each chapter, it was mostly so that there would be something that was at least vaguely interesting and accessible to readers who might not be interested in some of the nitty-gritty details that historians and exegetes sometimes dig into. But I actually found that it actually becomes an important part of the method, as it were. And it made me realize, on the one hand, that when we refuse to engage our imagination, we impoverish the stories, and often that particularly disadvantages us from hearing female voices from antiquity, because oftentimes their stories are not told in that much detail, and so we can't reconstruct them without drawing on the general of what we know and filling in some of the gaps and drawing some connections. But I also realized that the more I thought about it, I think that if we think about what we know about the historical Jesus, I think sometimes, for instance, I think sometimes we're misled by the abundance of narrative that we have into thinking that we have something that's fundamentally different from what we have for some of these ancient women, for instance. But what we have probably are details that were passed along, right? Much like the few details we have about maybe some other individuals. And then when someone was turning that into story, they had to draw the connections and flesh it out. And I think that's one of the reasons why we have some common details across some diverse tellings of what seem like they're probably the same story. In some instances, we're not quite sure. In some instances, there are clearly variations. And I think that sometimes we're misled by the imagination, or the narrating impulse, might be a better way of putting it, of ancient human beings, right? If we're going to do something that's actually interesting with history, then we have to not just provide a list of details that we think are reasonably secure, but we need to turn it into story. Without doing that, the history is not interesting. For some of us, it's also matters that's not relevant if we don't do that. But it's not even interesting. It's not even engaging as history, I think, unless we put our imaginations into gear. So let's see. I know there's some hands in the chat from other participants. So Joshua, did you spot any of those?
Walter had another comment. I have a comment, and there's some really interesting things happening in the chat, and I wanted to actually follow up on something that happened in the chat, but I think Walter had his hand up first.
See in the chat that they talk about the Manichaeism, and regarding Gavin McDowell, he was talking about angels that die in Evangelium. Actually, in the Manichaeism book of the Giants, and this book from Charlesworth, How Non-Canonical Texts Function in Early Judaism and Early Christianity, he puts a column of the Book of Giants from Sunderman. And there's the battle of the archangels, the 4 archangels against the 200 angels. And it seems like in this battle, 1 angel died.
Yeah, as I said, they're very much updating, and trying to incorporate some of these stories. We like these stories, and one thing that's clear to me is that even people who would say, yeah, ancient myths and things are just outmoded and not of interest, and then Apollo makes an appearance, and the Enterprise encounters him, and he's a literal existing being, or you get angelic beings or quasi-angelic beings, And what, if anything, distinguishes an Apollo or Q or any other figure like that from a god? You know, so I mean, in a lot of ways, the thing that I think is most interesting and it's harder to engage with is what's the place, if any, of sort of God with a capital G, gets kind of alluded to, in some franchises, right? Battlestar Galactica plays off sort of polytheistic humans and artificially intelligent Cylons with their one god, and it's just really fascinating stuff there. But working sort of the monotheistic or something like a monotheistic idea of God into story in a compelling way, I think is often much harder. And so it's not that surprising that we kind of go there a bit less often. And when we do, it reflects the same exact mysteries set in the future or set on other worlds that we encounter in this life, right? Because angels and polytheistic scenarios don't raise the questions of the meaning of existence or theodicy in the same way that, if you posit that there's one God who's supposed to be overseeing things. And so I think which stories get the sci-fi treatment and in what ways really is interesting, right? For the study of religion, for the study of what we like to continue from our ancient storytelling traditions. So I know we've got some other people here. I see Gabriel McKee has joined us on screen, and I'm trying to think, were there any other hands up before Gabriel popped in? Or
I mean, I had a comment.
Okay. Oh yes, that's right. You had a comment, please, and you control this more than anyone else does. So make sure that happens anytime. Sorry.
No, that's okay. I really enjoyed this conversation. Again, my specialty is in early Judaism and early Christianity as well, similar to Deb. And one thread that I found really interesting are the connections to the genre of apocalypticism that we have been subtly talking about through the various papers. One element of that is that I appreciate how a lot of sci-fi stories that were referenced yesterday really focused in on a seeker or an individual character who went and explored a world or saw something. And it hits upon the concept of like, what is root knowledge or revelation? And I immediately thought of like the Chronicles of Narnia. In the very first book, I hope this is a common example most people are familiar with. The two children use rings to go into a different world. It's a use of technology to go see something. And I think C.S. Lewis has some beautiful prose about what the worlds look like. And that vision of the world very much dictates their interactions with that world. I also think of the Paralandra series and how the main character goes to Mars and other places. And again, the same very vivid description of the world in some way cues the reader into what will be experienced in that. This reminds me of First Enoch. We've been talking about Enoch kind of in the background today. First Enoch in the parables of Enoch, but even in the Book of Watchers, there's visions that are happening. It's all through the eyes of Enoch and through the description of the characters in the world. The readers get cued into how the myth is operating, not just the myth itself, but there are cues within it. This brought me to a comment Gavin had pointed out in the chat, I don't know, 15 posts ago, way up, about how groups may or may not have continued on based on the mediums that they've chosen to talk about or use to convey their knowledge. I think Gavin had said something in the fact like he had wondered if these smaller groups were actually set aside because the general populace no longer connected with that type of vision. I think that's spot on, Gavin. I think that's absolutely correct. So like First Enoch was written from the 4th to the 1st century BCE. And I can compare that with, for example, the analogy to a book and how a book or visions or reading in some way seems to have taken over that role of the individual to see it. So rather than an individual going and then telling the story, divine powers or individuals were allowed to read that information. There's a shift in technology that happens, I would say, in early Christianity, in early Judaism, that gets at your point, Gavin, that I think that as notions of revelation changed in early Judaism and Christianity, the base technology or the roots genre or the medium itself changed. And so I would absolutely say, Gavin, you were right. I think different groups may or may not have fallen out of vogue because of the technology that they used to convey their revelation. I was thinking about the book concept. It comes up in Jubilees 36, in First Enoch 47, and Daniel 12. All of these apocalyptic texts from that earlier period in early Judaism, after post-exilic Judaism, after Jews came back from Babylon. And I think about how it's picked up in the book of Revelation. And I point that out because it seems like in the book of Revelation, you have the convergence of those several different types of genre and medium happening. It's John of Patmos is actually envisioning these things, but he's envisioning kind of the transition to an emphasis on book and divine knowledge being experienced through an individual person, that is Jesus, and how itself then that is accessible to other people through Jesus himself. So for me, at the end of 1st century, 2nd century CE, you start to see this transition, Gavin, that you were talking about, specifically in relation to medium and form, that gets played out in other texts like 2nd Baruch and 4 Ezra. So this is a really interesting thought, and I really appreciated all of the talk about technology and access to medium in yesterday's presentations.
Yeah, thanks. I'm not sure if Gavin wants to say anything in response to that. Since Joshua agrees with you, it's like might be thank you. That's carry on. So
I can make a comment. I wasn't excuse me. I wasn't so much talking about the media itself as not the medium, but the message. You should I guess I would say, because when I try to think of like the Manichaean creation myth, every time I feel like I've got a hold on it. I don't think if you asked me to write it out by memory, I don't think I would get it right, because it's too complicated. It's like once you have like the 5 sons of Adam that get trapped in matter, and then something else happens, and then there's abortions, and causing people to ejaculate on things. So you remember some key passages, but I don't remember the sequence of events. And I wonder, it was like Manichaeism is first of all a very demanding religion with a very complicated mythology. Sometimes I do wonder if they believe their myths. Like the famous book, Did the Greeks Believe Their Myths? And I don't remember what the answer is even to that. It's just, I wonder if it fell off the face of the earth because it was just too demanding. If you have like a science fiction universe that's too complicated, it kind of falls off the face of the earth and stops being popular. That's the sense I get. That's what I was talking about. So I'll shut up again.
No, thank you. Yeah. So Gabriel, I saw you joined us on screen, and so I'm guessing you have some thoughts. I saw some things you were contributing to the chat, and appreciated them.
Oh, I'm not fully awake yet, so but yeah, this is all fascinating discussion. I was thinking to myself as I was looking at the schedule today, if you want to present early at a conference, submit a paper on Genesis. If you want to present late, submit a paper on Revelation, because that's just the natural way for things to be ordered. But yeah, the discussion about apocalypse and what you were just saying about the complexity of mythology causing things to fall off. I think in many ways it's kind of the opposite, because what we see with things like Star Wars and Star Trek and the Marvel Universe is this kind of increasingly Baroque mythology actually becomes kind of a self-perpetuating mechanism that keeps things going. What's needed is something that gives new people a way in. So on the mythology side, I think a more basic story is kind of maybe the first hook, and then I don't know.
Miriam?
Yeah, I was kind of thinking about another point that's been going through my mind as well. The question, not only how can we understand the biblical traditions better when we look at science fiction, but also to see what kind of biblical and mythological ideas are taken from the Bible and from mythology into modern science fiction, and why. Like Gavin talked about this a little bit yesterday with Neon Genesis Evangelion. The question, why does the author use, this terminology with angels and these names and all that? And also in Star Trek and Star Wars, why are these very archetypal ways of storytelling used, but also why are those references made to gods and all that? And I think it's quite interesting because it asks, what kind of basic mythological needs we have, or what kind of basic mythological concepts speak to us, or if it's only the basics. I mean, with Eva, it's not really the basic concepts, it's really very apocryphal things that are used, and why. I mean, what's so fascinating and so helpful for the creator of that story about that? And I think that's also a very interesting perspective that we kind of touched upon several times yesterday, but never really talked about in long form.
Yeah, and one reason why I really valued the chance to hear from Maurice yesterday is that sometimes content creators just help us get clued in to methods and approaches to writing that are used, but sometimes it can answer specific questions. Like in the case of Eva, I would love to know, was it, this will make it resonate at this deeper level if we add these kinds of names and concepts and ideas, or is it's just too much work inventing new names for characters? Let's just pull a dictionary off the shelf and plunder it for names. And either of those could be true, and I'm not sure whether the end result ends up being different. Or Miriam asked in the chat, or is it just cool sounding? And once you find out that there's one angel with a cool name, right, a cool sounding name that sounds kind of sci-fi, then suddenly it's like, ooh, I'll bet you there's more of them. And so, on that note, let's see, Will and Gavin?
I was just going to pick up on Gavin's point. I've just recently purchased the Dune role-playing game book that's come out by Modiphius. And what fascinated with me is that the first half of this book is actually all about mythos and lore. It talks about the Orange Catholic Bible and the movement away from machines and human computers. And so if you wanted to actually have like a Bible of Dune, then what's happened is that the role-playing game as a source book has actually now created all of the information in one handy little book. And so I guess I wanted to pick up on this idea that role-playing games offer us an entry space to playfully engage with worlds in a way that I wish that that religion and church actually did. And in a sense, we almost seem a little foolish. I dressed like this today with my clerical collar and my Starfleet uniform to both confuse and engage. When I go and play board games in my local board game shop, I'll often go dressed like this or some other iteration of this, because I want people from both worlds to actually say, I'm curious about what's happening over there, so that we actually have a better chance of being able to pick up each other's stuff. There's a real danger that we have demythologized religion and spirituality to the point where we no longer believe that it's extraordinary, exceptional, or even interesting.
Thanks. Gavin, are you?
Yes, okay, I wasn't sure
Yeah.
if I was allowed to speak yet. Right, so I just wanted to respond to a specific point about the angel names. I did say that they definitely did plunder some secondary source. And of course, the accusation is that it's very superficial. But they could have just made the names up, which it does happen in some Japanese series. There are a couple others that kind of take the deep dives into, I guess, Judeo-Christian mythology There's one called I think Angel Sanctuary, which is primarily a manga, has a smaller. There's an anime of like 3 episodes that I've not even watched. They do take some of the traditional names, but they also make stuff up. And the 2 continuities in Eva, you have the rebuild films where the angels don't have names at all. They're just the first angel, second angel, third angel. And I think it does have an effect on the story. I mean, it's kind of, I mean, it seems kind of silly because you actually have to look up the names of the angels. They're not spoken on screen. But I feel like there's a certain level of depth. They went to the the trouble of looking up the names and vaguely correlating them with their aspects. I'm trying to think if I have anything. It's like I dislike the rebuild films in part because they strip the angels of their names. I like the TV show better for that rather silly reason. But if we're talking about superficiality, I was also thinking on, this is my last tangential note. So when we look at the Apocrypha, a lot of times people in an apologetic setting where they're talking badly, they say the Apocrypha are not true, and they misunderstand or get this wrong about the gospel stories. Like the Testament of Abraham, for instance, it begins by saying that Abraham's like 990 years old. So are these texts superficial as well? Or how deep does a text need to go to be I guess, legitimate example of Abrahamic mythopoesis, to borrow a term from, I think C.S. Lewis likes to use that term a lot. So there, I brought up an unrelated comment about Dune, but I don't want to waste. Is someone else going to speak? As I did bring something.
We're getting close to the end, and
Right. I don't want
jumping at the bit. Then not necessarily. I'm curious what you think. As if I think about some of the like Coptic magical papyri, some of the incantation bowls and things like that. The presumably these ancient traditions were doing what I said that the modern authors and possibly the creators of Eva might not have done, saying, what other ways can we combine consonants and vowels in interesting ways that will sound impressive and serve as characters in this storytelling and in the things that we're inscribing here. And so I think there, even if we envisage people coming up with sometimes very strange names or really almost comical in their simplicity sorts of names or in their fitting stereotypes, there's still something interesting to compare with, I think, ancient religious texts, and in particular the sort of the use of multiple angelic names in magic, where they needed so many of them that they clearly were getting creative. So Gavin, did you have some further thoughts along those lines?
Well, when you said that, it reminded me of one of the angels that gave me the most trouble was Tabriz, which I said was invented by Eliphas Levi, but he appended it to a rather loose translation of a legitimate, like an ancient occultic text associated with Apollonius of Tyana. And it just drove me mad trying to find it in an actual Greek manuscript until I consulted. There was a recent critical edition of this text that was published. And he stated exactly what I suspected. It was like Eliphas Levi just made this up. And Anna or whoever, they found this name. They said, "Oh, it's the angel of free will that will go well with our incarnate, pseudo Christ angel." And now Tabriz is he went from being this obscure genius made up for this occultic text, and now his face is on like advertising and in manga and on the side of beer, and in fan fiction, things like that. It became just by adopting this name, they made a significant contribution, I guess, to Abrahamic mythology. He's a star now. I think I'll stop there. I'll type out. I'll address Dune some other time.
Yes, and of course, addressing Dune when the novels have been around for so long, and yet the movie is about to be released. The question of the spoiler policies and things like that. I don't know. We could have a whole long debate about that, but we're getting close to the time when we need to wrap things up. And so just want to make sure that I say some of the things that one needs to say before people start disappearing for the break, which is that we will reconvene at 1:15 for our next session. I want to add that putting Genesis is something related that featured Genesis on day one and Revelation towards the end was not something that I did sort of consciously. So I was not thinking about canonical order, although these things sometimes happen subconsciously. But in between the beginning and the end, in between creation and apocalypse, we will have some space. And our second themed session is around space. Of course, one of the things that I think has to be said is that I tried to group papers together so that there would be natural points of intersection to talk about, some shared explorations and things like that. But the truth is, there are dystopian elements and things that we talk about in the space one and that we talked about last time. There are elements of creation in some of the ones in space, and things intersect left, right, and center. And so hopefully, as we get into our second and then our third panel, what will happen is that we'll find ourselves talking across some of these themes and seeing connections, not just within sessions, but also across them. So for those who have been joining us for this, I hope you found it rewarding. I hope you found that it was not merely a repeat of last time and were pleasantly surprised if you had been fearing that that would be the case. It never is. We always manage to bring creative things into this. Let's take a little break now, and we'll be back at 1:15. In the meantime, we can test the presenters sharing screens and do other things. So feel free to take a break. You can leave us and rejoin by 1:15 when we'll be starting our session on space. See you in space in a little while.